Omega Tau, Science and Engineering in your headphones.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of Omega Tau. So before we get to the episode, just a quick reminder, we have finally agreed on the program for the listener meetup between Omega Tau, Airline Pilot Guy, and Come Fly With Us on 21 September in Frankfurt. We'll do an airport tour of the Frankfurt airport in the afternoon and then meet in the evening, starting at about 6:30 in Raunheim in a pub called Bembelsche. That's original Hessisch. Please go to the Omega Tau website. On the website on the page for this episode, there is a registration link because we need to know who will come for various reasons. We have to figure out where we meet on the airport. We have to sign something for the tour and so on. All right, 21 September, go to the website, this episode page, and sign up. Should be a cool event. So, this episode. As you probably know, I've been interested in societal decision-making for a while. There are lots of obvious decisions we as societies have to make, lots of changes. For example, reacting to climate change is one, but there are other things, for example, that relate to societies getting older, the healthcare system, stuff like that. But it seems like we're not really good at making the right or the important decisions, even if we know, it's not always the case, but even if we know what the right way would be. By knowing, I mean there is science that tells us with very high confidence what we should do, but we don't. So I'm interested why we don't, right? Why we generally don't make these decisions or why it takes forever to make those. And I've had the interview with Joseph Tainter about societal complexity and collapse. That was something in this direction. Also in the episode with Igor Nikolic, we had a more engineering minded perspective on how we can understand socio-technical systems and then learn something about what decisions might be the right one. And in this episode, I have a little bit more of a political and economic perspective on that same question. Our guest is Maja Göpel. She's a political economist, and since 2017, she's also the chair of the German government's Advisory Council on Global Change. In German, that's the Wissenschaftlicher Beirat der Bundesregierung für globale Umweltveränderungen. She also wrote a book in 2016 called The Great Mindshift about sustainability, transformations, politics, economic, society, science. And so she has a very different view than what an engineer would perhaps say. She's also involved with Scientists for Future. She was one of the scientists who was part of the press conference in 2019 that kind of introduced this organization. So, different perspective, not necessarily a completely typical perspective for Omega Tau, but I think a very insightful one. Few comments before we start. You'll hear birds in the background because she's outside. It was beautiful weather in Berlin. My recorder died. Never happened before. I guess it had to happen at some point. So we lost a minute until I noticed. But you won't notice because there was a very good place in the conversation to stop a few seconds earlier. And I think it still makes perfect sense. And then a little bit of a bitter pill. We had less time than scheduled, so I didn't have the time to go into some of the science that's in her book. I had planned to and prepared to go into a little bit more detail, but she had to do something else after about 2/3 of the time we had originally kind of agreed on. And so some of that more in-depth science, I wasn't able to, there was no time. So, well, we'll see what we do about that. Maybe we can do something on some of these topics later with her or with a different guest. I think it's certainly interesting enough to do that. Oh, and before you ask, the reason why I did it in English is because, first of all, I wanted to make sure that the various episodes on one kind of topic area, like, for example, this one and Igor's and Joseph's, are in the same language, so you can listen together. And also, Maja has been quite present in German media, speaking German, and so I thought English would be useful for people who don't speak German. All right, let's get started with Maja introducing herself.
Well, my name's Maja Göpel, and I'm currently working as the Secretary General of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. And we are looking at how politics, basically, so shaping different laws, and doing investments in research and in supporting societal change can help societies to get the great transformation, as we call it, to sustainability on the way.
Right. So even though the title of the council didn't use the word climate, it's focused mainly on the big challenge regarding climate change, right?
Yes. And that is lost in translation because in German we're called the Advisory Council on Global Environmental Change. So I'm not sure what went wrong there, but it is very clearly rooted in the planetary idea.
All right. Okay. But I really want to focus in this conversation on the aspect of social change because my kind of starting hypothesis is that in many cases, also in climate change, we more or less know how society has to change. Not always in every detail, but basically we know. But we somehow don't get it done as a society. So I really want to focus on how to effect such changes, because personally I think that's the big challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we already saw that in the Brundtland report, 1987. When you look at it carefully, how it defined sustainable development, it was very clear that we have to change the social and technological ways that we organize our societies so that we don't disturb nature's capabilities to regenerate itself. So we don't have an environmental problem, we've got a societal problem.
Right. And also there are also other aspects of society where we have roughly similar problems. I mean, for example, the pension system, healthcare system, they all have certain problems where we kind of know the direction we would need to change them, but we somehow seem to be unable to do that. So I think it's even a more general problem than for climate science.
That's the whole notion of a great transformation, which the Council has made as well in a big report in 2011, that there are certain periods in history, so it really requires looking backwards a little bit to understand the magnitude of the kind of shift that we're looking at right now. There have been periods where basically a whole reconfiguration of our societies and the way that we do things and organize things, who we feel like is the we when we talk about we, and all that has been, really redesigned and recreated. And those have been intense times. And we're in the midst of one of those again.
Right. Absolutely. I'm sure you've seen the book by Tainter about collapse, where he suggests that societies at some point basically collapse under their own weight of the complexity they've built. And that's certainly one way of getting to a great change, right? It's not necessarily the one we want, I suspect.
No, there's a systems graph, basically, which is an 8 lying down, which is the panarchy concept, which shows that a lot of times systems, when they become too intensely organized towards a winning formula, they become very rigid. And also there is a lot of concentration on solutions of one particular kind. And the flexibility and the agility in the systems go down. And that moment often leads then to a phase where certain elements are collapsing or becoming so brittle that they implode. And then we can regenerate a new way of doing things out of, well, basically the pieces. But obviously it would be the way of looking forward to say, how can we get the flexibility back in the system so that it doesn't have to collapse, but that we really are managing that transformation more than we did in the past.
Right. In Tainter's, I had him on the show at some point, and to me it sounded almost like, so for me the word collapse has a negative connotation. For him, when looking at the big picture, I think he doesn't necessarily have that. He considers that kind of a natural thing, so that we then have an opportunity to restart. But of course, people suffer in that collapse, and so that's why I think it might be better if we, as you say, could do that in a more structured way.
That's the point. I mean, science, when you look at it from a structural view, and that's what science does, right? It tries to understand the patterns of systems and their dynamics and how they're evolving and how they're developing and what is the typical behavior they have. And from that point of view, collapse or friction or crisis only means that the way that things are being done right now come under stress. It doesn't have any normative element in it yet.
Yeah.
Whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to us, onto our ethics, onto our normative judgments. And sometimes even our societies today, we see that people have very different normative judgments of what is a desired thing that we should let go, that we should let collapse, let it fail gracefully at best. And what are the things that we really want to protect and want to regenerate and want to make sure it's part of the newer system. And this is why it is a highly political and a societal agenda when we talk about affecting that kind of change, not just pumping out new technologies that are presumably more efficient so that we can get more out of the planet than we did before and don't have to change anything of the system underneath.
And when you say political, you don't necessarily mean a bureaucratic process that many people consider not working too well, but I think you mean it's the challenges as a society to form an opinion where we want to go and what we want to change.
Yeah, I think it is important to understand that there are qualities of relations, and some are very political. It doesn't have to be within an institution that's called the state.
Yeah.
So we have very political relationships, for example, in any one organization. Sometimes it might even come down to family levels when there's a clear hierarchy and there's a clear way of doing things and some ideas about power. So for me, it is important also with democracy that we don't reduce it to tossing your vote at the ballot box occasionally, but it is a quality of building relationships that are based on feedback and are based on identifying what are the opinions and what are the majority opinions and how do you deal with minorities. So it is, for me, a description of qualities, and some of the relationships are very economic. That doesn't mean they're restricted to the market, even though we've really done all we can to make market relationships a basic way of organizing all aspects of our lives. But this means we've economized our way that we look at things, and that has effects, right? Well, it depends on how you perceive a relationship, and one that's based on love rather than on politics will have a different quality to it once again. And we have obviously shaped different institutions that are supposed to be that way, very officially so. But I think it's very, very important to understand that those qualities we can find in all institutions. And it is for us to find out the real mix, but also to not pretend it's not there when it's obviously part of the picture.
Yeah. So before we talk about things that can be done to effect changes, why is change so hard? What are the characteristics of the systems we have built, consciously or unconsciously, that make change something that kind of feels like the system is resisting?
Well, once again, we have some ideas from science that will have explanations why any one change is difficult for people, unless they really find it to be an attractive vision, so they're pulled towards something, or they find that what they have right now is something that has to cease, so they're being pushed away from a situation. But normally humans are a bit more reluctant to change than to stay in their routine. Simply there's a biological reason, because it's more economic in terms of the energy that we use. The more we run on autopilot, the less draining it is for us and the more relaxing it is for us. Yep. So that's a very old, just built-in feature that all biological beings will have. And then psychologically, we're always much better to see at the short term. We're not very good at the long term. So we would prioritize on the short term. That's still stuck with us since the hunter-gatherer places, where you didn't know where you would get the next food. So you'd shove it in right now to build up your calories and your fat, so you feed from in the future if necessary. And then there is this whole aspect about not being very good at reacting to things where we don't have a direct feedback. So on the whole environmental issues, we usually have the feedback delayed both in time, like the climate change comes in the future. It doesn't necessarily, for me, is directly coupled with me driving the car today, or it is in a different place. So the people suffering most from climate change are not the ones that are pumping out most of the CO2 right now. And there's another one where it's difficult for us to bring that feedback to understand the effects of our own activities. So all of that we know, and this means we could design systems that help us in bringing all that in our decision making, but we haven't. And that's the very particular analysis maybe of which characterizes the system that we're stuck in today, because that has incentivized and accelerated that kind of thinking, because we've very much worked on those animal spirits and given those incentives, like you should get a lot of bonus short term, you could push up the shareholder value very short term, and then after 3 years you're gone. It doesn't really matter what's going on with the firm, but you've made a lot of bucks. That feeds right onto our predispositions of not taking the responsibility for actions elsewhere, not looking into the future, unless it's our own. And so we've really created a system that very much reinforce the inability to look elsewhere, to look to the future, and to go beyond ourselves in what we take into consideration. And then the whole structures that we've built are becoming brittle unless we keep on taking out. So this whole acceleration logic, or accumulation logic, as the economists would say, is deeply built into the way that we've designed the systems. It is a friction for them. They'll become brittle unless we keep on pumping out from the monetary system. That will get very scared unless there is a lot of return for it in the short term right there. So we are right now feeding an outdated monetary system that's really extracting all the value from humans and their labor and from nature. And we're feeding that system and running down that stock of human ability and social ability and environmental ability in order to make sure that system doesn't come down, because we're scared that the system will collapse with all the effects that you said before are always negative effects for quite a lot of people if it comes down quickly. Yeah. But this is, for me, one of the aspects to really understand why it is so difficult to change, because it creates a lot of collective action problems when we don't believe that others will change, because we're all stuck in our own individual ways of, we're homo economicus people, so we'll just look after ourselves. So unless I take my back, no one else will. So that also creates an additional inability for us to overcome that short-termism, basically, and egoism in the way that we look at things.
So many of the things you just mentioned were basically targeted at the individual, right? You started basically with our, prehistory, where we got certain, if you will, biological biases. And you talked about a single person having to change and not be as ego-focused. But I think there are also, and you have some of those in your book as well, there are also more societal systematic issues, for example, that emergent behavior, I think that's a sentence I quoted from your book, has been locked in around chaotic attractors, or that there are feedback loops that make it systematically harder to change. So would you say there are also things that are societal in the sense of the systems we've installed that make it hard to change those? Kind of self-resisting?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those were the aspects that I mentioned. With the kind of stock orientation in big firms right now. I mean, they have to make sure that their stock market value stays up. And then the incentives for the people running those organizations is to get a lot of money through the bonuses and stock or share buybacks, and all that are effects of those incentives. And yet at the same time, they'll get in trouble. If they don't manage to keep the stock value very high, then the investments might go somewhere else and the whole firm might go down. So those are just one example how we've slowly but surely changed the laws so that corporates, A, become people, especially in the United States, in front of the law, and B, have to run after the highest shareholder value in what they do. And that prohibits a lot of the things that we would say could help a regenerative business model that looks at the health of the entire system, including its people, and the basically environmental basis that it is set on. And you have loads of examples there, like Ben & Jerry's, when they decided to go public, they weren't allowed to have that limit on the pay gap any longer of 1 to 10, I think, is it that they had between people living or working there. Or Anita Roddick with a body shop, when she sold out to L'Oreal, she thought, I can roll out my system where I'm really working with indigenous communities and all of that to really try to help them nurture the livelihoods they have, and really roll it out. But the total reverse was the case, that she said it was her biggest mistake because she had to change that business model because it wasn't delivering enough for the shareholders. And those are exactly the kinds of systems that we've built. And we've got the other example in the political sphere, because we've got this electorate and we reduce democracy to that. And then everyone that's being elected is trying to run after getting more votes. And this means you're not very much going for disruptive change that will hamper your constituency too much, even though in the midterm it might benefit everybody. So we have a lot of those systems built on this short-termism that keep us going in the direction, make it really hard for individuals to change, because it might become a high-risk strategy. If you're too few that are really going a different way, it just might mean that you're being very separate from what the normal way of societal development is. In the UK, we say, we could lower the working hours to 30 or something, and this means you have more free time, so you get basically time wealth instead of loads of monetary wealth. And so you can reduce your shopping and consumption and have happier lifestyles, because we do know from happiness research that is something that people really, really value, spending time with people and looking after their health or exercising, all those elements that will do us good. But for them, it is a threat because they've all taken out mortgages. And when the wages don't go up, it means that they are fearful if they reduce their working hours, they can't stay the mortgage. And that's basically their life insurance in that country. There's a lot of structures that we've built around us that make it very difficult to get out of this.
So if you will blame all of this short-termism and these systems we've built on ancient biological biases, then a pessimist would say, well, I guess we can't change. So, I mean, it's just how it is. That's just how humans are. It's a very pessimistic perspective.
No, it's not so. I think the idea is that we understand this. So this enables us to change it. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all know that we're not just biological robots, right? I mean, it's really interesting how you see the discourse shift from that. Once we're the enlightened crown of evolution, and the next moment when it comes to, could you stop doing this cum ex kind of deals that are really screwing over societies only to the benefits of very few already very wealthy people? You're really strapping our social systems of the taxes that they need to look for childcare and healthcare, etc. Then all of a sudden, people come back with the explanation, but that's just how humans are. We are just greedy. And so it's the responsibility of the politicians. They have created systems with loopholes. So we don't have any other choice, exploit the loopholes. But that's obviously a civilizational failure and not so much biological, because in other moments we've managed to contain that. And we've had morals and we had ethics that were guiding ourselves. Or as Hegel put it, the spirit around the law that you need, because you can't always, and we would not want, even though we're building digital systems now that can control everybody and monitor everybody all the time. So there's a self-steering element that comes out of morale and that comes out of norms and that comes out of the way that we look at the world. And this is why we absolutely have the possibility to liberate ourselves from that story and work on the evolution of humans, because we've changed a lot in the recent 100 and 150 years, and we've changed a lot before. So we absolutely have to stand up against saying the evolution of humanity has stopped when Homo economicus was invented, because it was invented at a time, right?
Yeah, and I didn't want to suggest that that's the case, but I guess the problem then becomes, how can we as a society make changes as a group that from an individual perspective might either be objectively disadvantageous in the short term or just more generally go against our biases, right? That's the challenge then. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you say that society has done that in the past, and that's obviously true. We have evolved a lot as a society. On the other hand, we can see that, for example, in the context of climate change, where we've known for at least 20 years in which direction we have to make changes, it's at best very, very slow, and it feels like society is kind of, fighting against it implicitly. So how do we resolve this conflict?
Well, it's a really large-scale system that we're looking at there, right? Because it is the development model that we've rolled out through globalization as the winning model after the world wars, because it seemed to really help, right? I mean, if you've got a lot of material wealth that you can spread out, the chances for conflict are lower. And that's the whole growth paradigm, basically. You don't have to talk about distribution if you can say that the pie is going to grow ever bigger, so everybody's going to get a bigger slice. And this is for the first time what we're up against right now, because formerly it was always possible to expand, not always to the benefit of the territories you expanded into. I think that is something that's really, really important to say when it's the success story of the Europeans, for example. I think it does require for a very decent look into history and what that did to the people that we've expanded to. But now we're at the end of it. We've reached the planetary boundaries for expansion. So for the first time, and this is why we've got this new term, the Anthropocene, we have a planetary impact of the human race. There is no new territory for us to discover. And this is why, I don't know if that's true, but I just heard 2 days ago the Chinese have the triple plan, and that's cyber and the deep sea and the orbit to exploit as new territories for us to get the resources from that we then have to feed in one in the same system. And this is why it's important to say, look, I mean, it's time to rethink that system, because what we have here and have inherited here is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful planet. There is not much to be seen anywhere close that would resemble this. And there is enough for everybody if we just really work on changing not so much the planet in order to feed the same economic system, but change the economic system so that we can safeguard the planet and help well-being for the people, because we do understand that people don't get happier from just having more all the time. And this is why it's a battle about what needs to change right now, because everybody understands there is this big thing up. And this is why I think it's so important to work towards or use this as an opportunity, as something like a new enlightenment or a renaissance or whatever you might want to call it. But it has to be an integral part. And it was in the Brundtland report. It is an upset of the human self-image that we understand that we live on spaceship Earth. That was 1968. So the first time we could see this, that there is this one blue and green marble floating around.
Yep.
So in the report, it very clearly says this. It's like the Copernican revolution. Mm-hmm. Yet again, we have to rethink who we are and how do we live up to this new reality. But if a world society has to do that, it does take a lot of time.
Exactly.
I mean, big changes in big systems do take a lot of time. And yet I think we shouldn't be too discouraged, because right now it feels like there's a bit of a tipping point. And those are the moments where a sufficient amount of friction, positive or negative, mind you, in the existing system exists so that it is challenged. So it doesn't perpetuate itself as unconstrained anymore.
Mm. So one thing you said is that if everybody gets enlightened and notices that we need things to change, then we will have, a groundswell of initiatives from everybody, from societal groups, from individuals. They don't fly anymore, they buy an electric car, whatever. And that is one way of getting to that change. Sure, that works, no question, but it might be very slow, right? It might be so slow that the Earth, if you will, dies before we get to that point. So is there a way of, from a government perspective or from some other organizational perspective to accelerate that kind of movement in a kind of controlled way in a certain direction? And I'm asking about this because I guess we agree that society is very complex and that it's very hard to, if you will, change something on the dials in a way that we know what the outcome will be, because we don't know how the complex system will react. So how do we do that? How do we consciously evolve in a certain direction without hoping that everybody will notice basically by themselves, and the people who don't, the old guys will die, the old guys with their old ways will die, and a new generation takes 30 years. How do we do that? For me, this is really completely unclear.
I think the very most important thing is to never go for the either or, because
of course,
obviously we can't just sit here and say everybody's come meditate, look out of the window, and we'll teach you the books of quantum physics, because we understand that loads of you still think Newton physics, and that's unfortunately not how the world works. So it's not only a spiritual enlightened thing, it is also the basic knowledge with which we are going forward in engineering, right? So there is this update, this paradigm shift, as we call it, but at the same time, we also discover the world and shape the world by practice. And so for me, this is why I like Gramsci so much, because he's got the theory of practice approach, and that goes into reinforcement mechanisms, so very systemic in a particular way, to say the more we explore and the more we try different things, the more we also understand them differently, and we see that it works differently. And then obviously we have practitioners. We've got a fantastic division of labor. I mean, that is the basic idea, to say, what have we understood from people like Machiavelli and others that have tried to understand how can societies work? They always said we need the entrepreneurial bits that do in the practice. We need the kind of thinkers, be they philosophers or be they scientists, that are helping us to understand and make sense and sort and organize and find patterns, etc., from the things that they observe on the practice side. And then we've got people that are shaping the rules, because every system has rules. And that is the big responsibility that we've given over to, you could say, the Leviathan, which was still the story that people would otherwise just kill each other. So the wolves would all just feast on each other, on the weakest. And this is why it is a good idea for a civilization to say we're going to set the rules that we can proceed with keeping as many as possible in part of the pack, right? And this is why I think it is so important to understand that this is an upward and downward causality. So people making sense of the world in a different way will try different things, will discover different things. I mean, the new materials that we detect, the whole biomimicry, this quantum physics, basically, that says, oh, it's not a very thingy world, actually. It's a very energy and relational world. And then people with that kind of idea in their head will look at the things that they find in the real world very differently. And then you can understand how you can make the case for politicians to organize the rules differently that we're developing or with which we're incentivizing people. And I mean, the biggest demand from sustainability discourse is obviously to start pricing the use of nature, because that's the biggest market failure that we have. And when you understand markets being guided by prices, you must understand that those prices should reflect a little bit the ecological reality, because otherwise we're systematically undermining the future potentials of generating prosperity. We're running down the capital. And those are the things. I don't know why it takes so long, but right now we've got another opportunity to actually bring it on if the IMF and all these other institutions are also saying it. So it takes a time, but it is always this feedback loop between the thinking and the acting and the regulating that will, create this upward and downward causality of driving systems change. And this is why we need to get out of the either or camps and always look at what is the next, the adjacent possible that will let us reconfigure basically the systems that we have so that more sustainability comes in and more of the destructive practice that we have goes out. And this is why I called it in the book radical incrementalism. You have to have,
that's a nice word, by the way.
Because it's another thing where people are always saying, oh, you're not radical enough. Oh, that incremental stuff isn't sufficient. We're so prone to just look at camping, like one camp, the other camp, and then they can't possibly marry, and you have to choose which camp you're in. And then everybody that tries to criticize your particular proposal, which might be very specific and very concrete and very inviting, and they chuck a label on it just to make sure you're fostered in one camp that doesn't sound very attractive right now. So this campism, or whatever you might want to call it, the dichotomy, artificial ways of separation and polarization is, for me, one of the biggest cultural failures that we have right now, that we need to overcome so that we can find this next possible step. The adjacent possible is the thing that the systems people would say, and then keep going. Don't become complacent and say, I've got now sustainability PR report, so done, we're a sustainable company. No, acknowledge in that report that we're very far away from being a sustainable company, and that we'll need a roadmap of 10, 15 years to try to get there. And that means doing things very differently tomorrow. And then see how the system reacts and keep going. This adaptive management.
So I agree that this would be great. But so I'm still stuck. So you said before that this is a very slow process, right? And I think the question is, again, how can we accelerate this? And if I were a pessimist, I would say, okay, we need to change the rules to, for example, price, nature, or other externalities. No question. But we don't do this because the people who would have to change the rules, they're not willing to do this. And now you can come up with reasons. For example, they might be bribed or whatever. You can be more cynical or less cynical. But basically the system we've set up isn't able to seem to make those changes to our rules. And then the question is, okay, so maybe then are the rules by which we design the systems that makes the rules wrong? So, I mean, you can take this one step further. And in the end, unless we accept that it takes dozens of years for things to change, because that's kind of the natural incremental way, I don't see how we can accelerate it. And the things you suggest sound to me also like there is a natural progression. People learn, people get enlightened, people have ideas, the market reacts a little bit incrementally, and then, but it takes for a long time.
No, there's windows of opportunity, right? Where we do have in German we call it Häufigkeitsverdichtung. So there is a moment where a lot of elements come together in an unprecedented way. So there might be new technologies available right now. Renewable energies are cheaper than the fossils now for the first time. No one anticipated it to go down that quickly. There's a whole gold rush running after storage right now. So the solution for having a renewable energy systems are really progressing very fast right now. Also because the economics shifted. And this has been a fantastic accelerator of that was formerly quite stuck. So it was a window of opportunity because of that was coupled with the kind of moral revolution that the Fridays for Future are bringing onto the planet now. They're saying, look, you people, it's nice that you find that here all fine and complacent, but you're ruining our future. So there's a huge new voice that is making itself heard in the political discourse, and that demands that kind of action. And that allows, I mean, it's a bit sad for scientists to hear politicians say, oh, we didn't expect climate to become such a topic in society.
Yeah.
And I think, Jesus Christ, I mean, aren't you supposed to act upon your knowledge and your, basically your consciousness, and not just demographics and public opinion?
Well, but they don't. That's the point, right? They act based on, as you said before, very specific incentives for themselves.
Not all of them. And this is the other important thing, that you really want to, we call it finding the new alliances, right? So that you don't say, oh, politics is all bad, and the whole economy will die. And again, we're using these containers, and rather thinking in strategies and thinking in coalitions for change that are sharing that mental space, that are going for the same vision, that have the same purpose, where they say we want to have a fundamentally differently running economy and society. And then to see who of them has influence on what kind of rules, or on what kind of educational systems, or whatever it takes, or sits on a pot of money. And so to become very creative in shaping those alliances, and not go with our typical way of looking at the world, all politicians are bad, unless they're in themselves systems, the whole thing that we call state and parties and whatever. So we have to find the ones that want to work towards us. And there's always going to be a backlash as well. This is why politics are everywhere, right? But I think it doesn't really make a lot of sense to be a pessimist, because what can we gain? For me, that's being a cynicist right now, is either that you've become so depressed, which is sad, and that means your friends should hang out with you, and try to make you see what you can still affect today, to rediscover your effectiveness, your personal effectiveness on the small steps, or to say it is only a position that privileged people can be in. And that's what I feel is a lot happening right now, with quite a lot of people that are living a very comfortable life and just say, oh no, there's climate change, I know, but I don't want to change, bam. And I don't believe it's possible, and so I'm out of the picture of taking responsibility. But all of that is changing, and sometimes public opinion can change very swiftly. And so that we do anticipate those windows of opportunity well, and try to bring the ideas and the coalitions in place that can then help making much more deep and much more broad change at a given period, where the brittleness becomes quite big, that was formerly unimaginable. And this is why right now I think it is so important to prepare for the next financial crisis. Because the last one, we've just only kind of said, oh Jesus, we've got to do everything to keep that thing up there, which means we've basically accelerated again the exploitative way of making a lot of money, and got an unprecedented inequality in our world society. But yet we know it's coming. And if the OECD runs conferences how to avoid collapse, or how to use it when it's coming, that it shows quite clearly that it's there, this awareness. And this is what I feel are the windows of opportunity. And it's not going to be nice and easy and we're all going to dance along necessarily, but it is possible. And this is why the whole evolution of humanity has always had intense periods where a lot of things were changing very quickly. And then you had more, they feel stable, even though quite often it just means that something else is undermined that you don't have in your view. And so it is a messy thing, but that's what human evolution has been about. And I think when we look back as a woman, it's amazing what we've achieved.
Absolutely.
This is why I think that for me it is so important to understand the future is made by the things that we fit into the system today. So the more we try to bring in the positive, the more we try to show how it can be done differently, the more it has a chance to be part of what is going to come next. And we know it's going to be a next. We know this thing won't work much longer. And this is why I think it is the story of heroes in the 21st century is definitely a collective one.
I mean, I'm playing the pessimist here, of course, a little bit also because I want to provoke you into suggesting what we can do. And I obviously totally agree with everything you said about the historic perspective. The women's rights is the perfect example. However, I think with previous societal changes, we didn't have a deadline, right? So we could basically run their natural course, accelerated by people, activists and stuff. With climate change, we do have a deadline, more or less strict, depending on exactly how you look at it. And so for me, the question is the traditional natural way of getting to these changes fast enough? Or, you know, the reason why I was asking about the political system is not because I wanted to bash it, but because I might suggest we have to somehow change the political system so it's able to make the decisions we need it to make, right? It's like one meta level up from the decision itself.
Absolutely.
Some of the thoughts I have.
No, and that's true. I mean, that is absolutely true. And I think this is why we talk about needing to think about transition policy and needing to think about how we can govern just transitions, has been the term that's been brought up right now. But then to really understand that needs a totally different mode of doing things. Yeah. It needs for a very clear determination that's not questioned anymore. Yeah. So this whole, maybe, no, energy transition, not so much. And then we're going to change this. And I mean, even our corporations right now are saying, you are really making life hard for us because you're not putting the framework conditions in place. Yeah. If we knew there were long, loud legal signals that were very clear, we could shift investments big time, because then we can tell our investors that this is going to be the future return that we have to go for. So unless the framework conditions are firm, the investment flows will not be firm either. Yep. And this is the one thing, to just be very clear, this is why the whole idea of roadmaps and targets are important. Yep. And then to say it needs for a different way of listening to people and dealing, and that we see through the backlash of the populist movements, that it needs much more of a listening policy and much more of a collaborative way of reshaping the identities and the ways that we live in those places that are most effective. And this is why we've suggested something like transition hubs in every one of those transition regions, be it the coal regions or agriculture is going to be the next thing. Germany's going to be hit by automobile changes big time. I mean, everybody's scared like crazy what this will mean for our economy, but we are very clear that it's not going to be avoidable. So how do you anticipate this and put this in and start talking honestly and really free those kind of institutions, those transition hubs, give them a clear mandate, make sure that they're not part of the political party negotiations that are short-termed, but that it is an independent institution that can hold this vision, and then have professionals that are trained in holding processes. So we've got a whole thing about make transition region networks and really fund them for people to be good facilitators that have not an own interest in basically shaping the outcome or putting in wrong information just for people to not be able to agree on anything. It is an art that we have to take serious. I mean, we talk about management in companies all the time, but we're not really talking about how can this happen on societies in a much better level. Mm. And I think the community fora, for example, in South Africa are a very good role model for that, because apartheid and getting out of apartheid probably would have been much messier had those not happened. And it was an intentional way of shaping spaces where the antagonists were invited in, but then facilitated in a way that one would try to not agree on everything, but again, find the possibility to agree on the adjacent next possible with the vision that this system has to end. And this is why we are saying it needs new institutions and it needs transition policy rather than the normal way of trying to get somewhere. And the party politics right now are just unbearable from that point of view, because no one's putting forward an idea without adding the sentence, which other party is against this idea and thus ruining our future. So it is a culture shift that would really help us accelerate this right now, because from my point of view, a lot of people, person you meet in the street, when you really talk with them, at least here in Brandenburg, where the lakes are going low and people are seeing them the shoreline just growing and growing and growing, and now all the trees dying, they feel it and they do say we have to do things differently.
See, and this is, for me, this is the big mystery. Everybody except whatever 10-20% probably says we need to change, and I'm willing to do that. But the society as a whole, when we make collective decisions, doesn't, I would say, reflect that with the urgency that it should have. For me, this is the big issue.
Yeah, and this is why it's fantastic that we have not only the Fridays for Future in the street, but the Psychologists for Future that are saying we're going to help share the knowledge about working with denial. And then we've got the Developers for Future that are saying we're going to help shape the technologies that enable people to collaborate better, but also to produce things better. So really going to work purposefully, so future-friendly technologies. And then we've got the educators for future that want to chip in and say, we're going to help people understand this. And then we've got more and more social scientists coming out and saying, we want to help shape those kinds of institutions that can help us overcome the collective action problem. I mean, those are all researched fields. Why is it difficult to change?
Yep.
And just to get that knowledge out of the peer review publishing journals, which is the way that we set up our scientific system right now, and say, we basically need you all around in society right now. We need scientists to come in society, and we need journalists to be playing a much stronger role again, because we see through social media how everything is just being, what I think is true, I'll just declare as true. And use the new technologies now to make it for everybody impossible to understand that I've really fabricated this and tweaked the imagery, etc. So when we think again about the division of labor that we've understood is quite helpful if you want to run peaceful societies that come to joint decisions and be orientated towards the common good. Those are really important areas. What is the knowledge that we trust? Because if I trust the knowledge, I'm much more willing to also change what I've been doing. How can I trust the rules? That I'm not the only one changing, but enough people will do this so that I don't fall behind, and B, the magnitude of change will come and get us towards the identified problems magnitude. And then, and then the facilitation element, to have trust in the process again. And for me, those are all the elements. And we've only looked at quantity, output all the time. And we've totally forgotten about the quality of processes that will make all of that much more possible or less possible. So for me, that is the big win right now.
In your opinion, so when in your book you talked about how transformations work. They have a build-up, not much is happening, right? Then there's a tipping point, and after the tipping point, lots of change happens in a short time. Do you think we are at one of these tipping points regarding climate change right now, and the associated societal changes? Are we at one right now, do you think?
Yes, I think we are. Because we've got the knowledge there, and we've got the experience there. I mean, it hits home, right? The people that are benefiting from that globalization model, the resource-intensive one, are being affected by it now. So this notion of it only will get the others is crumbling away. We do have the economics behind it now. We do have finance starting to shift, when they're now, even through a risk lens, obliged to be taking that into consideration. A certain degree of long-termism comes in. If that really becomes more watertight, that's huge. And we do have much more willingness and experimentation around imagining different lives. And I think this is the other one why the future, for future movement is so powerful, because they're not stuck in just imagining this way of living a life. But are still at the outset of being able to imagine quite a lot of ways of living. But the whole new work agenda is there, right? People are saying, I don't feel purpose in this job anymore. So from so many angles, people start, even the ones that should be winners under this system, start feeling that they're actually not being helped to bring out the best in them, and not being helped to live the good life in the ways that they have to do things. And that's massive. That's fantastic, because then it's not only an environmental agenda, but it's much wider. And this is scary. I mean, this is fantastic to be living at this particular point in time.
Do you think we're at a global tipping point, or do you think different countries, maybe those that are maybe a little bit more in a growth phase, still in a catch-up phase, let's say China, India, maybe, do you think there is a tipping point as well? Because, of course, in addition to the societal problem in one society, we have the problem of, in some sense, having to coordinate that worldwide.
Well, I think they all know. The reactions are not always the ones to say, hey, we can make this spaceship Earth for everybody. This is why geopolitics today are shifting so much. I think we cannot understand the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing right now without looking at the environmental basis also with respect to that. And obviously that will be one of the big diplomatic things to look at. Can we manage without needing something like a world war again? That enabled for the first time for the United Nations to think as a global unity. I mean, that's amazing. When you think of it historically, that was the 20th century.
Kind of a common enemy of the whole world, the climate, right? The kind of, if you will.
It could be that, exactly. Or you get stuck in we know there's not going to be enough for everybody, so we're just going to make sure we are the ones that are swimming on top. And I think we have exactly those two response units basically right now. One that feels, I don't really want to engage with this, I just want to live my life. And then the two different moves. One saying, hey, we can do this. There is a planet that is big enough for everyone. And the other one is, oh, sorry, we don't see anything that can work for 9-8 billion. So we're just going to make sure we ramp up the shores and make up the big fences and get the sales of bunkers that are atomic proof in California. I'll speak to that. And this is why it is such a tipping point in the true sense. It can tip it either way now.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're running out of time. Any last words you want to say to our listeners before I press the stop button here?
No, I think for me, the most important thing right now is to totally come out of the defense, because I noticed so much how we always had to argue our case for change as something that is threatening, something that seemed to be somehow good just because it was here, right? The status quo, the structural power, the status quo. And then we had to argue our proposals for renewables, for regenerative agriculture, or what on the indicators that are behind driving this old system. And the people that are saying, oh, it's impossible to change, never had to argue what the consequences are of maintaining the status quo.
True.
And this is the possibility that we have with the for future, because everybody, and this is for me the cognitive tipping point, understands now that perpetuating the status quo is the most utopian thing that you could say today. And this is why we have to be very clear and say, no, this is not going to continue unless you give us the evidence how this can continue. We're going to proceed with the alternatives to get a level playing field in having to argue what is a good next step. For me, that is the moment where we're at right now. And this is why it is so fantastic, because everybody can do that. You can say, what's productivity for you? What do you mean we're losing out on productivity? That's a totally outdated concept. You're saying we want to pump out yet more out of people, or we want to replace them with robots because the productivity, as your old metric will tell you, is going to go up more. Come on, give me a break. You're really for the past. We're talking about productivity that looks at how do we get resource productivity really well done up so that it can fit within the regenerative circles of our planet. This is the new reality we're working with, and this is for future. So you can decide, do you want to be in the camp for the past or do you want to be in the camp for the future?
All right. Cool. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your sunny day in Berlin.
Will do. And you enjoy the rest of the day, even though it's not sunny.
It might become. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Ciao.
All right. Thank you, Maja, very much for being on the show. And maybe we can do this again at some point and going into a bit more of the scientific foundations and theories. For example, you mentioned Gramsci and Panarchy and stuff like that, and I didn't follow up because of the time limit. I really would like to explore these things at some point. There's something else I realized after I thought a bit about this after the interview. As you notice, I'm kind of searching for ways how we can, if you will, accelerate the decision making in the right direction. And I mean, obviously, I'm not the only one, right? Many people are. For example, one of the best examples is Lawrence Lessig, who you maybe know from the Creative Commons license stuff. But he has at some point decided to stop fighting copyright issues and focus on, if you will, one meta level higher, which is how do we make decisions as a society? And then in particular, how does the political system work? And he identified the influence of money in the US as the main issue why decisions aren't necessarily made based on the, if you will of the people. He nicely illustrated that by saying basically every dollar in the US has a vote, not every person. And so he said that before ever trying to think about fixing copyright, we first have to fix the way we make decisions and the way we represent, if you will, the will of those who are governed. And then he focused on corruption, and corruption in the widest sense. He wrote a book, Republic Lost, which is very much worth reading. It's a few years old. But of course, it's how likely is it that systems will change to get money out of the system? Because, of course, the money that is influential now will make sure it keeps its influence. So anyway, so these are the problems, right? So from my perspective. And Maja was more arguing, more that, people have to become enlightened. They have to understand. You need a groundswell of a different emphasis, if you will, of a different lifestyle. At some point, there will be a tipping point, and the organizations that run society, in particular politics, won't be able to ignore it any longer, right? That's basically what you said. And of course, there are things you can do to accelerate this a little bit, but not much. And so my pessimism about all these other things not working because, money will keep its influence kind of means that we're basically left with only this groundswell, which is basically what Maja was suggesting. And to me, that is, it's hopeful in some way, because it means that if enough people think different, then things will change. And of course, there are lots of examples in history. We talked about women's rights in the interview. But it also means that process can't really be accelerated, really. Fundamentally. And so that means we might be screwed because we have a deadline, right? We can't, take all the time in the world to react in a sensible way to, the changing climate. And so that doesn't increase my optimism. On the other hand, as she said, you can't just be a pessimist, right? So I'm not a pessimist. But, and it's not just climate, right? All kinds of things. Like the education system needs more money. And why doesn't it get more money? It shouldn't be even a political left-right issue, right? Just giving money to educate our children and children's children should be obvious. And it's not really happening to the degree it's necessary. So there's lots of examples where if you ask probably everybody in isolation, should we give more money to education? Most people would say yes. And as soon as it gets into the political power play, into the systems we've set up, into the game theoretical environment, if you will, right, falls through, doesn't happen. Anyway, talked enough. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know. I intend to record more episodes in this direction. They won't displace the real science and engineering stuff, but I'm really interested in this and I'm going to explore that further. All right, that's enough. Talk to you in about 2 weeks. Ciao. Hello, Markus here for Omega Tau. Omega Tau is an independent and non-commercial podcast produced by Nora Ludewig and me, Markus Völter. We are on the web at omegatau-podcast.net. You can also find us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter under the handle Omega Tau Podcast. We love to hear from you through a comment on the website, a post via our social network channels, or via an email at feedback@omegatau-podcast.net. We also always appreciate recommendations of Omega Tau to your friends, directly or through social media. Omega Tau is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative License 3.0. This means that you can freely share the content, but you cannot use it for commercial purposes, and you cannot distribute derivative works. You always have to attribute the source, omegatau-podcast.net. Any quotations or citations of our work are perfectly fine, of course. For more details on the license, see creativecommons.org. Thank you for listening to this episode of our podcast, and talk to you next time.
Omega Tau.